we have regrets from Trustee Holman. This is a special public budget meeting, the purpose of which is to discuss the development of the 2022-2023 preliminary budget and any recommendations arising in this meeting for the board to consider. Hopefully there will be a recommendation for adoption, which would mean that at the June 15 meeting of the board, we would be able to adopt the budget bylaw for this. In terms of process, after we adopt the agenda, I anticipate that the Secretary Treasurer will provide a report. And following that, the board may wish to move into Committee of the Whole. If it does so, I will then ask Vice Chair Vanwell to assume the chair to conduct that committee meeting pursuant to Chapter 52 of Robert's Rules. And you may recall that the Committee of the Whole meeting is similar to our other committee meetings in that the rules of procedure are relaxed a little bit. Trustees are able to speak unlimited time, but Trustee McMurphy only for the 2-minute limit each time. And if a trustee has not spoken and wishes to, they'll receive priority according to Trustee Vanwell over someone who's already spoken. Similar to our other committee meetings, it's anticipated again, if the board moves into committee, that partners and others who may wish to contribute may do so after the committee members have spoken, which in this case is the trustees. Following that discussion, perhaps there will be a recommendation arising from Committee of the Whole, which would then be reported to the board and debated by the board before the meeting tonight. I wish to welcome members, well, first of all, members of our management team. I see Superintendent Eberwin beside me and Secretary Treasurer Reid on screen, Assistant Superintendent McKenzie, and here at the table, Trustees Braniff and Hunter. Did I say that?
And you just said Jason was on screen.
Did I say that too?
Yeah. Other than that, would you like to start over?
We're off to a good start.
You got our names, we're okay.
Director Murphy, you don't miss that. Thank you. From the Saanich teachers, we have Mr. Sean Hayes. I love your dad. From the Saanich Administrators Association, we have Mr. Sean Hayes. From the Saanich Teachers Association, we have its president, Mr. Michael McEwen, on his way, I'm told. And from QP 441, we have Ms. Nola Walsh. And I don't believe, welcome Nola, and I don't believe that we have anyone from COPAX, the district TAC yet. So, have I got through that sufficiently, folks? As well, of course, I wish to acknowledge that we're meeting tonight on the traditional territories of the Saanich peoples who have lived, worked, and learned here since time immemorial, and we offer this acknowledgement respectfully and in the hope that it will further reconciliation of our community. With that, let's move please to adoption of the agenda. Is there a motion to adopt the agenda? Trustee Siltzer, is there a seconder? Trustee Vanwell, are there any proposed late items or revisions? All in favor of adoption then? Opposed? And the agenda is adopted. Moving then to item 3, the 2022-23 preliminary budget, and I'll turn to Secretary Treasurer Reid for his report.
Presentation is on the screen. I think everybody can see that. So what I wanted to talk about tonight, I wanted to explain in a little bit more detail the budget pressure that we're facing in 22-23 and perhaps beyond. And just to provide some more understanding and background on the budgetary conundrum facing us, and to expand on the discussions regarding that we've had in back meetings through the process. We'll speak briefly about alternatives for balancing the budget. The briefing note that went to the Budget Advisory Committee meeting presenting the alternatives for consideration was included in the meeting package, as were the notes from the May 17th Budget Advisory Committee meeting, where the committee basically decided to not make a recommendation, but forward the information that came to committee onto the board for consideration. And then finally, in the last slide, and this slideshow was provided in advance, in the last slide I provided links to documents that I felt were relevant for the board's consideration of balancing the budget tonight. So to provide an overview of the budget pressure for 22-23, I'd like to discuss first the purpose of the contingency reserve, the pressures that we're facing on our budgetary balance, forecasted operating surplus, and why it's necessary to find $1 million. So the purpose of the contingency reserve is it allows revenue and expenditure fluctuations to be managed more effectively, because it allows budget planning to reflect a likely scenario or even a possible scenario rather than a conservative scenario. And so without a contingency reserve, which was the case in many budget planning cycles prior to about 5 or 6 years ago, there would be large fluctuations and swing in budget pressure because we didn't have that cushion to basically carry us over into the year where we could see, where the chips actually fall. How do we finish the prior year? What does the enrollment look like, etc. So without contingency reserve, the budget pressure for next year would actually be around $3 million, because that is what we're seeing in this year's forecast in terms of structural pressure and budgetary balance, and inflationary pressures in 22-23. And I'll explain a bit more about that in a minute. So maintaining contingency reserve is critical to ensuring future program sustainability, and it's not a source of continuing funding. So the pressures on the budgetary balance for next year, honestly, things didn't start off that great, and they've, as you know, they've gone from bad to worse. And where we started is, for the past 2 years, budget sustainability was already a high risk because accumulated surplus reserves, so those reserve balances that we are using to fund continuing expenditures, had grown to the point where we really can't increase them any further. And that's why this has been, budget sustainability has been the #1 risk in the risk report for the past 2 years. And so this was already something we were concerned about. And then where we started to get, this year, where we started to get a lot more concern was in late fall, when we started to see in the fiscal forecast that our expenditures were trending much closer to budget than in previous years. And so year over year, the way that we were able to use reserves to pay for continuing expenditures is it balances out with the average underspend relative to budget in each of the previous years. You know, as a simple example, if we establish a budget and each year we underspend it by $2 million, then we can put $2 million in reserves into each year going forward and things will balance. And so that having the expenditures trend much closer to budget means that we're expecting that we're going to consume accumulated surplus this year rather than it maintain the status quo. And this is an indicator that the current level of accumulated surplus amount being used to pay for continuing expenditures may not be sustainable. In fact, there's a good chance that this is sustainable. And this is even before we talk about inflationary pressures in 22, 23. And there are pressures in there that we hope don't persist. Our replacement costs have been really high this year, higher this year than they actually were in the previous year because of the Omicron wave. And our utility costs have been higher, and we are also seeing, we're not seeing the historical underspend we have seen in the past in our service supply budgets, which we attribute to escalating inflation. And so that's one factor. So things weren't looking great already. And then in March, once we saw what the funding rates were, and we learned that they were completely unchanged from the previous year, and really no accounting for any inflationary pressures. And then the announcement of the change to the Employment Standards Act, which added another $400,000 approximately to our inflationary pressures in 22, 23. So that is a pressure that's on top of our concern around structural balance to begin with. And the other factor is that our enrollment growth is forecasted to moderate. And the registration data thus far has corroborated those forecasts. We're not seeing a huge uptick in registrations at this point. So I wanted to spend a bit of time on this chart. This shows the history of accumulated surplus, and really since I joined the district, and I remember each one of these years in excruciating detail. And 16, 17 was not a great year. Our accumulated surplus dipped down to $1.4 million, and almost all of that was in carry forward balances. And carry forward balances, it's multi-year funding for programs. It's equipment replacement in schools that schools plan for. And it's also timing differences in program funding. Like we receive funding for certain programs and then the costs are incurred in the following year. So it's timing differences as well. When I look at the forecast for 2022, 23, it is actually more concerning to me than 16, 17. Even though we will have a lot more accumulated surplus, it is the appropriation of accumulated surplus, that green portion of the square that I'm most concerned with, and the trajectory of expenditures. And so the other, the yellow part are carry forward balances. The green is how much is appropriated for budget, so how much is coming out of reserve to pay for continuing expenditures. And then the blue is the contingency reserve. And so that's the part that's not being appropriated. That's the part that can be used in the future or for other unexpected items. And when I look back through time, you can see in 1819, 1718, there was no appropriation of reserves for budget because there were none. And then we saw growth we had made reductions in those few years, and we were into a balanced position. We were growing. So in 1819, we appropriated close to $1 million in continuing expenditures. And then in 1920, that increased to about 1.26 million. And we were comfortable with that in 1920, appropriating 1.26 million because the previous 2 years, our underspend relative to budget was 1.75 million. And so we felt we're kind of into this groove where we can take this amount of reserve and we know it's going to be replenished by our underspend. And so at that point, it was viewed to be sustainable. And then we actually finished the year a lot better than we would have expected in 1920. And when you look into 2021, our accumulated surplus balance grew from around just over 5 million to 6.7 million. And that's because we did really well in 1920 relative to budget. And it was primarily because of the suspension of in-class instruction in the spring of 2020. We didn't incur replacement costs, our service supply expenditures went down, and we actually at that time we restricted non-essential expenditures because we knew 2021 was going to be a rough year, and so we intentionally restricted expenditures and we pushed accumulated surplus going into 2021 up to 6.7 million. And you can see in 2021, that amount that was appropriated to balance the budget was enormous. It was, I think, $4.1 million. And that was to cover off a significant decline in international program revenue. And it also covered off the cost of we experienced a really significant decrease in our brick and mortar schools. And so we ended up having our brick and mortar schools overstaffed by about 15 FTE, $1.5 million. And so that's why we had an appropriation of $4.1 million in 2021. But then when you look to the next year, 21-22, our accumulated surplus actually went up a bit. It should have gone way down. But what happened is during 2021, we received about $3.6 million in federal and provincial pandemic money. And so for most of that big green portion in 2021, we didn't need to spend it. And so we came into 21-22, our accumulated surplus actually grew to about 6.9 million. And we also were able to reduce our appropriation of accumulated surplus to 2.4 million, which at the time, and we discussed this time last year, which at the time I didn't view to be sustainable, but I felt that we had a path to sustainability because growth back to our historical international program enrollment would bring another $1 million or more in net revenue to the district. So I thought we have a path back to 1.4 million, $1.3 million appropriation, which is where I wanted us to get to. But then this year hasn't gone according to plan, as I described in the previous slide. And what this downslope shows going into 2020, 22-23 is that reflects what I mentioned before, that our actual expenditures are trending very close to budget, which means that big green blob in 21-22 that we appropriated to pay for continuing expenditures, we're actually needing to use all that to cover continuing expenditures this year. And so we're expecting a significant decrease in accumulated surplus. And in fact, our forecast for June is looking even less favorable than it did last month. Normally, we're in the position where it gets better and better as things unfold and we learn more, and this year it's going the other way. And so when I look at 22-23, and that appropriation of accumulated surplus there is around 2.5 million, and so that reflects the reduction of $1 million for inflationary pressures. That is what we have to appropriate if we only could $1 million. And looking at our updated forecast in June, I think that contingency reserve, that small amount there, which is about $400,000 or $500,000, it could be zero. We're hoping it will be better than that, but it could end up being zero. So this next chart shows the trajectory. And so you can see, looking back from 16-17 to 2021, we've always underspent the budget. Or we've had an annual surplus, which means in 2021 we actually, because we appropriated accumulated surplus of $4 million, and we had an annual surplus of a couple $100,000, it means we actually underspent the budget by like $4.4 million. So an important thing to consider is before the pandemic, we had a pretty good handle on what our actual budgetary balance was, based on the previous few years, based on what we expected to happen next year. But as I explained, 19-20 or 2021 and 21-22 were completely skewed by the pandemic. We're coming out of this not really understanding where budgetary balance is. And when I look at that line going downwards, I think, well, the trajectory sure isn't good right now, but a lot of it is pandemic-related items. Like we're more than $500,000 over budget in teacher replacement this year, which makes sense. We're over budget in support staff replacement. We're over budget by hundreds of thousands of dollars in utilities. And so I would expect that line to improve. And the hope is that that line does improve and that our enrollment's a little bit higher than we're forecasting, and that perhaps government sees the errors of their ways and decides to fund the changes to the Employment Standards Act. And so when I'm recommending that we make a reduction of $1 million, I am only looking at the inflationary pressures next year. I actually think we probably need to reduce next year as well, but it is so hard to know what that is going to look like, because it's so hard to know how much of those pressures we're experiencing this year are going to persist into next year. So as I said, this is the trajectory, and for 21-22, that negative figure or decrease in accumulated surplus is basically reflecting consuming the $2.4 million that was appropriated to pay for continuing expenditures, because we're trending so close to budget now. Whereas this time, almost in the previous 5 or 6 years, at this time of year, we'd be underspending the budget by $1.5 million, $2 million. So that is a big concern. So why it's necessary to find $1 million? This reduction is necessary only to offset the inflationary pressures alone, so the $1.2 million. And it doesn't address the potential structural imbalance as indicated by our forecast and our current trajectory. And so finding only $1 million is already a calculated risk, reflecting the possibility that financial results in enrollment may be better than forecast. And I strongly believe that that we should not be making reductions. Certainly we have to, because of the importance of maintaining program stability. This does have to be balanced, though, with the implications of depleting the contingency reserve, because then we start to lose the luxury of doing that. And so it's not easy to know where exactly to find the balance, but with the continuing deterioration of our expenditures relative to budget into June, I am certain that we need to find at least $1 million, and we may need to find more next year. But that it makes sense to wait and see if we have growth that we can apply to the budget pressure, and if there are other things that change that can be applied to the budget pressure. So I'm not going to spend as much time on alternatives to balancing the budget, because we discussed that a lot in back, and everybody here was in back, and so I will briefly say that the alternatives to balancing the budget were informed by comparative budget analysis, so looking at similar districts and how much they spent per student in all the various program areas, and then reflecting on why is it different and what does it mean. We considered priorities in the strategic plan and our risk management priorities. We also considered collective agreement requirements, and particularly class size and composition language, because as we discussed in back, that basically limits where reductions can be made to the majority of function 1 instruction. And then we considered viable alternatives that were identified during the consultation. And so these were the alternatives for balancing the budget that were presented in back. This is the table. This is the same table that is in the briefing note that went to the May 17th back meeting, which is included in the package. And then on the last page, I just provided the links ahead of time with the documents that I felt would be helpful to review. So that concludes the presentation, and I'm happy to answer questions at this point.
I think it would be probably appropriate if the board considered moving into committee of the whole before any questions or takes place. Structure to it. So the relevant motion would be, if a trustee wishes to, that the board move to committee of the whole for the purpose of discussing the 2022-2023 budget and considering recommendations for balancing the 2022-2023 budget. Is there a motion? I'm sorry? What about the vice chair?
No, it's chair.
We have to get there first.
Part of the motion.
I don't, it's not necessary. Thank you. Trustee Silzer?
I still move.
All right. Is there a seconder? Trustee Stell? Thank you. Is there any debate on the motion? All in favor? And opposed? And the motion is carried. And so thank you. We will move into committee of the whole, and as previously indicated, I'll call on Trustee Vice Chair Van Wel to chair the committee portion of the meeting. We'll trade places so that you can see everybody adequately. If you like. Vice Chair Van Hall, thank you.
Thanks, Chair. All right, so now that we're in committee of the whole, we can open up the floor to discussions, questions that anybody has. Questions? Mrs. Selk.
Thank you, through the chair to the secretary treasurer. Is there a legislated minimum amount for the contingency fund or the contingency reserve?
No, there is not. There is guidance, and ministry requires that districts have a policy on setting a contingency reserve, but there is no statutory requirement on having a contingency reserve. The statutory requirement is that a board cannot budget for or incur an accumulated operating deficit.
Okay, and
that's inclusive of everything in accumulated surplus.
can I ask a follow-up question? And as a general practice, what is the percentage that school districts would normally shoot for in their contingency reserve fund as a proportion of the entire budget?
Yeah, the districts that have percentage guidelines, generally, I've seen 2 to 3, 4% of the operating budget. We didn't do that in, I didn't recommend that when the board developed the policy because I felt the contingency reserve should reflect the financial risk and also be flexible enough to respond to events like pandemic, for example. And so our board policy simply says that something to the extent, and I'm paraphrasing slightly, that the contingency reserve is set at a level that's appropriate to prevent financial risk and risk to program stability. So it's more general.
Thank you.
Any other trustees have any questions? Any thoughts? I will put my name down on. So in terms of the alternatives for balancing the budget, I'd like to put it out to our trustees, the fellow trustees. So the proposed alternatives equal to 1,080,100. We are looking for $1 million, sorry. We are looking for $1 million, and my thoughts are that the implementation of transportation fees for cost inflation might be something that we'd like to take off the table. I think that, with everything else going on, that we added extra fees on to our parents may not be appropriate.
So I'd like to comment on that. I think one of the things that we're looking at is we want to encourage bus ridership amongst the students. And I think to impose a fee is maybe counterproductive, and also I got a sense from staff that it's very difficult to administer. So I just think it doesn't sit well. We just had a PAC meeting with the Deep Cove PAC on Monday and about bus transportation, and I think that that's not going to. We'll be doing something with one hand that we're taking away with the other.
Trustee Seltzer?
I would like to know what that $80,000 represents in terms of staff reduction. In other words, if 4 FTEs of IST and BS teacher allocation represents 425,000, is 80,000 just short of a quarter of that? I mean, in other words, could we almost save a special needs teacher Through the chair to the secretary treasurer.
80,000. 80,100.
Yeah.
It's almost exactly 0.75.
Well, that's where I would like the board to put the priority on special needs student support rather than transportation fees, because on the whole, I think our district has quite, parents are generally have the means to pay a nominal amount for transportation.
Trustee McCarthy. Well, I'll put a motion on the floor and we can see where that goes. In terms of alternatives for balancing the budget, I would move that the proposed 2022-23 budget be balanced through the following reductions. And that would be working from the list of alternatives that were offered. That would be 345,000, 106,300, reduce IS TBS teacher allocation by 2 FTEs, that would be 212,600. Reading recovery 18,000, teacher leader 10,600, venture program supplemental 35, information technology budget reduction 70,000. Which would bring the reductions to a total, I think, in my math, of $797,500. I have other motions to make, but I thought maybe those are some that we could perhaps agree on at the onset.
I'll second that.
Okay, thank you very much. If I can speak to that motion, and particularly I want to speak, I guess, to the change in the IST teacher allocation by 2 FTE. I think there's a lot riding on this budget, obviously, in a whole lot of different directions and because of a whole lot of different circumstances. One is we've committed to a new strategic plan, the first plank of which is literacy. And I think that, and the second one, I don't know if it's the second or the third, is mental wellness, mental health and wellness. And to me, staffing in this area is one of the crucial parts of the decisions we're going to make tonight. And I know we have to make some reductions, but I cannot justify taking 4 teachers out of that particular mix, which I think is pretty crucial to the direction that we want to go in. We've committed ourselves to going in. I know, I mean, I would be happier to not have any reductions at all, but we are looking for big dollars here. So that's why I've sort of found a, I hope, middle position on that one. I think that the other thing that I want to speak of is the fact that we undertook extensive consultation. And I'm not saying that the board has to do everything that it heard and everything that it was told in the consultation process. But one of the longest, strongest, loudest, most impassioned voices that came through almost through every type of consultation we had was a concern about that proposal. And so I feel a need to be responsive to what we asked a question, we got an answer, and we have to deal with that. The other thing that I'm concerned about is the other reason why I think we can get to a balanced budget tonight is like our overall budget is approximately $100 million, and I know a lot of that is capital and a lot of it is fixed with salaries and everything else. But I cannot believe that in a $100 million budget we can't find 1%. Even through nitty-gritty, picky little things. And unfortunately, we as trustees can't do that because we don't have access to the pages and pages and pages of budget budget notes and budget allocations and budget funds and, this pot, that pot, this other commitment, this person has this much, this person has, I mean, we just don't know that as trustees. And so that would be the kind of a, I'm just saying that the scale of the budget we have, we should be able to find $100,000 somewhere. And I appreciate the fact that this may sound like I'm saying that staff haven't worked hard enough, and I'm not saying that at all. I'm just saying that as a board, I feel confident that we should be able to say as a board, we want the money to stay in this category. Could you please advise us where we can find it somewhere else? I've heard, we've gone to the government before as a board. We've come close to the line, and Jason will remember that all too well, I suppose. But, and I do think, in conjunction with these decisions we're making tonight, we have to look at the leadership that we're getting from our provincial bodies, because I have not, could be just I'm not in the right circles, but I have not heard our provincial bodies, including our own, the BC School Trustees Association, being, passing motions is one thing, but actively campaigning to do something about the fact that we're not being funded for inflationary pressures, I think is something that we need to get not only the BCSTA to do it, but all of our other provincial bodies to take, a bit of a more vociferous public leadership role in that. I know that we have to adopt a budget tonight, and I appreciate what the Secretary Treasurer has said about we have so many unknowns that it's difficult not to be very cautious in looking at the budget. But I'm willing to take that risk tonight so that we can keep what we know we need in place as much as we possibly can. I know that if we need to review our budget in the fall, when numbers are more clear, we know what our enrollment is, we know what our surplus, our underspends are, when we know what our various commitments and what the government is doing with regard to negotiations with our various, particularly with teachers, and what that impact that's going to have on us. I'm confident that our staff will bring us any, if we need to review the budget, we'll make different decisions in the fall or in January when we look at the budget again, we can do that. But I just don't want to start out the year with a feeling that I'm undermining our commitment to things like our strat plan and our key planks in our strat plan by cutting something that seems to me to be so germane to it. So that's why I'm suggesting that we reduce the cut, which is even the two, that's still a lot to the ISTs. And then I think we should turn our minds to seeing where we can find another $100,000 or $200,000 to balance off that cut. So that's my motion, the first part of it, to bring us to 7,975.
Thank you, Trustee McMurphy. So we'll, Trustee Stout.
I think Chair Dunford was first.
He is giving the floor to you.
Thank you. I am very disappointed that we're cutting teacher positions. I think we heard loud and clear from our extensive consultation that these IST and the ELL positions were crucial. And I agree with Trustee McMurphy. We went through the strategic plan, we committed to this, we've done the consultation, and it's heartbreaking because I know what it's like to be in the classroom and not to have that support. I think I agree with the motion to. We have to balance our budget. We don't have a choice, but I think we need to take a risk, and I appreciate it's very uncomfortable, But I'm hopeful that Mr. Gray with his the international program and perhaps with some of the other things that we're planning to do, that we will be able to find this money. And we're not going to have to do what Victoria has done to go to public fundraising or private fundraising for music programs, which is appalling. And that we can work hard. You know, this is a disappointing cuts in all areas, but particularly I think on the teacher end, and that we just find the money. And I've got a motion I'd like to bring forward or propose later about advocacy for unfunded inflationary costs and the role of the STA. And I think we need to advocate as well for this employment standards change, which is almost $500,000. So that would pay for, you know, would pay for at least several positions, probably at least three.
Chair Dunford.
Thank you, Trustee Manuel. I'm not yet sure how I will vote on the motion. I seconded it so that we could discuss it because I think there's plenty of merit in discussing it. But I'm very frustrated that we find ourselves in this position. I want to express, from my perspective as a trustee, my appreciation to staff, and particularly to Secretary Treasurer Reid and the Finance Department for the work that is the arduous and detailed work and particularization that has gone into this analysis. But I wonder if we might make some further progress on this motion with further discussion. And I'll come back to that in a moment. I thought these days were gone, and I'm very frustrated that they're not through no effort in the district. I once read a definition of politics that it's the allocation of scarce resources, and by golly, does that apply here? And I struggle, as I've expressed it back on more than one occasion, with applying the criteria to balancing, to making the if there were a formula, which there isn't, it would make our job easy, but that's why we're being paid the big bucks, I suppose. Well, yes, I know. Will you be the volunteer to leave, Trustee?
I have my 16,000, that'll balance the budget.
But there is no such formula. And so in my mind, when I go back to the reference point on making these kinds of decisions, there are a number of criteria. Obviously, we have to ensure solvency. And that's why we have to honor the advice of staff to a large extent. And the risks attendant to that. At the same time, balanced in that formula, if I may call it that, is the best interests of the district and our students. And within that, a further factor of the priority of student education. And Trustee McMurphy, I think, and Trustee Stelton both addressed that when they spoke of the strategic plan and its priorities, three of which I think clearly fall into risk if we cut as much as we do from the IST, the behavioral support contingent. So all of these considerations swirl around the table as we try to do the best and right thing, minimizing disruption and supporting students as much as we can, supporting the priorities of our strat plan as much as we can, and ensuring a reasonable balance of risk. Those are what I think we're talking about. And there's no easy way to get there. I do understand that this is the largest proposed cut. I do understand that it was the largest area of consultation feedback. And I'm not going to repeat what I said it back about how do we treat consultation. We need to do it, but we also have to weigh it and balance it. At the same time, it does seem to me that the fact that we have exceeded our ratios beyond the minimum required by collective agreement isn't the full answer. That's clearly a place that's available to us, and we should consider it as a result of that. But at the same time, the other side of that coin is if we're going backwards, having made those decisions in past years to invest in our staff, to invest in our vulnerable students, now we're faced with going backwards. And I wonder if this compromise proposed by Trustee Murphy is a workable one. I'll leave my comments at this point with this hope that as we further debate this motion, maybe we can get some idea of where the additional some $200,000, I guess, 250. The trustee, I think your number was 790.75, was it, trustee? So if we're looking to get $1 million, we need to find two. This is why I'm
225.
yeah, I wonder, without putting anybody on the spot, if we can have some useful discussion about the options there before I at least make a decision on whether I'll support this motion. Thanks.
Thank you, Chair.
So I don't know yet how I'm going to vote on this motion, because the dilemma for me is, of course, we don't want to make cuts in these teaching areas. But on the other hand, I trust totally Secretary Treasurer Reid. And if he tells me this is, we can't touch any more of the contingency reserve, and I think we've heard your presentation, Secretary Treasurer, about 5 times. And we get it. So I guess my question back to Secretary Treasurer through the chair is, would you find $202,500 from someplace else if we went with Trustee McMurphy's motion?
I'll say broadly, there's nowhere where I can see that we can find administrative efficiencies. Administration was the focus in previous budget cycles, and 15, 16, 16, 17 was actually mandated by the province that we make reductions in those areas, and we were mandated to find $700,000 of reductions in those areas, which is 16%. Easily by the 16% of the budget. And so I don't think there are areas that I can say that's an administrative efficiency. I think if we're going to find savings in another area, we have to look at, well, what does it mean in terms of service? There are certain things that we just can't do without. We have, as an example, we have a payroll department with 3 people in it. They can hardly keep up. We have 1 less person there, people aren't going to get paid. Health and safety is an area where we've invested, but we were honestly compelled to do that when WorkSafe, and we've achieved rate reductions, significant rate reductions from the work in that area. Looking at service and supplies, we are low in that area because historically that has been a big area where savings have been found. And we're kind of at the point where we really struggle to do the things we need to do. Recently had to replace some wheelchair lifts and to basically go for it was like trying to find loose couch change from 5 different budgets to pay for it, because they don't have enough money in supply budgets. And the other concern I have with equipment and supply budgets is I don't think a reduction in that area is actually sustainable. And the result of that is, say we find $200,000 in equipment and service supplies, we take it out of the budget, but we don't actually save the expenditures because we will end up doing what we need to do to meet our statutory requirements. Schools are accessible, and schools are safe. And we're actually seeing that in our forecast this year. Historically, the last few years, if you're budgeting conservatively as you should see underspend, kind of puddles of underspend throughout the district that accumulate and then move into that accumulated surplus reserve that we then put right back into the budget. And we're seeing that tighten and tighten and tighten. And so if we were to take $200,000 out of the equipment, out of an equipment and supply replacement budget, I think we'll end up just be taking it out of that differential between underspend and budget, if you know what I mean. Like, I don't, because we're so close to the line in terms of having the money we need to actually fund what we have to do, that I think the money will be spent anyways. And we'll just be reducing our ability to generate that surplus, that differential between actual and budget that we then push into the budget next year. So we could reduce the budget by $200,000, but then we'll have to reduce the appropriation year after by $200,000. We'll be chasing our tail. And that is, and that's why I think if we're looking for reductions in other areas, I don't think it's a good idea to simply say we're going to reduce in this area and we'll figure it out. I think we should have an understanding of what it means in terms of the actual program reduction. And some of the areas discussed in the budget consultation included teacher leaders, which we don't have a lot. Up there, there's about 1.6 FTE. And those positions are critical to implementing a number of strategic priorities and initiatives in there. In our view, positions of leverage that create change throughout the district. And so it's possible to reduce those positions. They're not required by the collective agreement, but I think whatever the reductions are, whether it's in administration or district leadership and operations or education, I think we need to understand what the service reduction is, because there will be one, because there are no more areas of simply finding efficiencies.
Yes. Okay, so you're saying we can't find another 200,000. And if I understand correctly from previous meetings, that these teacher reductions have already, in a sense, been affected through the staffing process. So the IST and BS teachers have been reduced. And so the next question is, okay, this is a preliminary budget, and then the September 30th figures come in, and then we vote in October on the actual budget for 22-23. At that time, if we find that the picture is better than we thought, can those special education teachers can we recruit for them? Or as we've heard before, they're going to be otherwise engaged and we won't find anybody, or is there a possibility that we would? So sorry to be confusing the question, but anyway, is that enough for you to respond?
Yeah, so we're into June now, so the staffing process is wrapped up in May, and so the notices and layoffs have all gone out and reflect these reductions, but it can be basically rescinded at any time. I would say though, if they're submitted in September, the chance of finding specialist teacher positions is pretty slim. They'll have the job, they'll be somewhere, I imagine. Does that answer your question?
Yeah. Yes, thank you.
Trustee Thorpe.
Yeah, thanks. We're getting into discussion, which is not part of the motion, but I think it's going to be relevant anyway. I mean, I think we could adopt what's on the floor and then maybe we need to through the result of further discussion, but we're into the discussion, so I'm going to throw my 2 bits worth in too. I guess where I feel is a bit of discomfort is if we're looking for $200,000, I believe that we should be looking for small amounts. Like, I'm not saying we should cut another teacher. I'm not saying we should, eliminate this service or that, purchase or whatever. I'm saying we need to find small bits. I'm talking like, for example, just to set an example, as trustees, perhaps we could say, we will forego the built-in annual increase to our stipend. I mean, that would save us somewhere between $2,500 and $5,000. But maybe that's the kind of, nitty-gritty examination of the budgets that we have to do. And the other thing I think that I don't feel is particularly sacrosanct, having been through this a number of times, and I appreciate all the cautionary notes and remarks and graphs and warnings that you've given us, Secretary Treasurer, as Chair Dunford said, your work is brilliant, and I'm not faulting it at all. I really appreciate and admire what you've done. But by the same token, we have to, as trustees, make those decisions. And we could say, for example, that as trustees, we're willing to say that contingency reserve is smaller than planned at the moment by $100,000 will do us. We are willing to gamble on taking $100,000 out of the contingency reserve and putting it into the operating budget, and then find another $100,000, piecemeal here and there, as I said, to get to that $1 million reduction that we need to find. It sounds really petty. I think that's the stage we're at. And we can't do it as trustees. As I said earlier, we don't have any knowledge of those piles of budget sheets and all the allocations here, there, and everywhere, and where we could pick up 1,000 here, or 5,000 there, or 10,000 there, and come up with $100,000, and then take 100 of, reduce the contingency by 100 or something like that. I wish I had that information. I wish I had access to that information. But as trustees, it would be very difficult for us to pour, as an uninformed group, through those documents. We need to rely on our staff who do have the knowledge, who do have, the understanding to do that for us if we want that done. I think we can rely on our staff certainly to do that if that's the decision we make. So I think it's possible to do it. I think it's possible to get a balanced budget and reduce the contingency slightly and find, say, $100,000 here, there, and everywhere.
Thanks. Yeah, so I'm not on the Budget Advisory Committee, but I was at the last meeting and the meeting before. And it was really clear that there wasn't, I would say, I'm also immensely grateful for the work that was done, but there wasn't an appetite, at least that was my perspective, for adopting these cuts in this way. And I think if people were, continue to reference the strategic plan and the need for teacher support. And I think, I guess I'm at a point now where I'm ready to roll the dice. I'm ready to just take a gamble. If we take 200,000 out of the contingency reserve, that's what we do. And then we work really hard to, find the money, or we look for another 25 or 50 or whatever. We reduce travel budgets. I'm certainly you know, I agree with Trustee Murphy, you know, maybe there are some small economies. You know, we hope that the international can grow to cover off some of these things, and then we work hard on advocacy. So I think we need to, I'm going to support the motion. I think we find that $202,500. And if it has to come from contingency, it comes from contingency, and then we work it out in the fall. I'm willing to take the risk.
So I have myself on this list. So do you want to respond to that?
Sure, just to clarify, the contingency reserve, our worst case scenario for our forecast right now is that there will be no contingency reserve next year, that the amount that we have appropriate to balance with $1 million, with finding this $1 million is recommended, we need to appropriate roughly $22.5 million. And that basically drains the entire contingency reserve based on our worst case scenario. And it actually could be a little bit negative, which means we would need to be finding it out of carry forward balances, which is always possible. And we can always find more out of carry forward balances. But the concern here for me is the sustainability and then the impact on 23-24, because the further down we go, the bigger the budget pressure becomes in 23-24. And so it's kind of balancing the short term with limiting what could be a really significant budget pressure in 2024.
And that is what I was actually going to address. I think sustainability part is a big part of it. I think that we, as much as I would like to support the motion, I think that that kicking the can down the road might prove we might have to do more cuts than we realize next year, and that's going to put a bigger pressure on our budget for the following year. So I am wondering about the sustainability of keeping, only doing the 2 FTE instead of the 4 at this point. So we have Trustee Seltzer.
We're really between a rock and a hard place, as they say, because we do have a responsibility for student success, not just to the end of our term, but beyond. And draining the contingency reserve doesn't sound like one of the responsible things to do. And I guess I'm kind of leaning with to go with the preliminary budget and see what happens in September. And in a sense, it's already been launched. And I agree with Trustees McMurphy and Stelk that it doesn't seem like finding 1% of budget should be so hard. And I asked the question about a month ago, can't we just take 1% across the board of every budget and find it that way? But there are reasons why we cannot, valid reasons why we can't. And certainly we can't, by June 30th, we have to submit a balanced budget. So, yes, I just wanted to put that out there. Thank you.
Could I ask the Secretary Treasurer to repeat for my thick head the implications for the contingency fund that he just spoke of? I'm not sure I fully grasped it, and particularly what you see happening if Part of this 2025 is funded by.
Bring on the presentation. So this is the slide where I was saying this current school year we're in, we're appropriating just over 2.4 million. Going into next year, the current budget with the proposed finding $1 million, we still need to appropriate roughly $2.5 million. And so in previous years, that appropriation of accumulated surplus came from underspend relative to budget in the previous year. But because we are so close to the line, we're spending very close to what we budgeted. So that means this amount is coming out of accumulated surplus. And the way we're finding the 2.5 next year is taking the contingency reserve here from 21-22 and moving it into the green box, appropriation of accumulated surplus for next year. And in this chart, we're showing the contingency reserve at 400,000, but our latest forecast has it possibly like at 0 or maybe a little bit worse. And if it was negative, we would need to find that money on carry forward balances. So schools that saved up to replace the copier, stuff like that, we would need to pull back money from schools.
So if I may, as a supplementary question, Chair, the best case has us at 400,000 before the June fiscal forecast.
I wouldn't say it's the best case. This was the last forecast, the May forecast. Our June forecast, where it's looking a little bit worse than that. Finding $1 million assumes that this, before those inflationary pressures hit us in 2023, that the pressures we're seeing this year aren't all continuing. So the $1 million reduction does not cover this at all. It covers the inflationary pressures we haven't even experienced yet. So finding $1 million is already a pretty risky move because we're assuming that this trend, apart from not reflecting the inflationary pressures next year, but that this trend of spending very close to the line on budget is going to change next year, because a lot of the reasons for that line going down is replacement costs, utility costs, because we're taking COVID measures with fresh air intake, and pressures in our service supply budgets.
So my last question at this point, I think, is, so in answer to Trustee Silver's earlier question about where the 2025 could come from, that's why you didn't offer the contingency fund at that point. You talked about services and supplies and equipment.
Yeah, the one thing I want to say is that Megan and I both get quite nervous when we start looking with this level of precision at the forecast, because we're talking about hundreds of thousands of dollars or even $1 million, and it's like 1% of our budget. And we know our accumulated surplus is going to go down. Not much is for certain, but it's possible. There are a number of things that, an example of that, one unknown is our medical dental account with the benefit carrier. We pay premiums into it, and then they report to us what the cash costs were, and if the premiums go more than that, that money comes back as revenue into our budget. So there are things like that that could push this forecasted line flatter. But finding $1 million is already assuming that this line's flat, pretty flat. And so this is the hard part of forecasting is we're now talking about hundreds of thousands of dollars, but we can't actually forecast with that level of precision.
Thank you, that's a great explanation. Chair Duffy, did you have any other questions at this time? Okay, thank you. Superintendent?
Thank you. It goes without saying that this is obviously a very difficult decision that the board needs to make. As you know better than anybody that your prime mandate is to that student success and opportunities once they leave the K-12 system, and it is difficult to cut people, especially people who have supported children, sometimes in one-to-one or small group situations, and I fully appreciate that challenge before the board tonight and later this month. I don't think I will divulge any secrets that the Secretary Treasurer and I have had in private conversations, but when he talks about his concern and Director Smeglia's concern over the unpredictability of accurate forecasting, I know in our conversation, the Secretary Treasurer said at a minimum, we should be looking for $1 million. The comfort level would be much better if it was 1.5 or $2 million that the board was looking to find. And so I know when he has put together this forecast with the director that even the $1 million that we're looking for is uncomfortably low. That as Trustee Benoit said, if we push the can down the road to next year, I feel we won't be looking for trying to find $200,000 in perhaps supply and services. We'd be cutting even deeper into core services, and the pain would be potentially much deeper. And I appreciated the Secretary Treasurer's comments about, yes, we could probably find $200,000 in supply and services, but it doesn't mean that money won't be spent. And so because we're not by any means doing anything extravagant out there. There are already issues where schools are unable to afford things. I am particularly concerned about the rate of inflation. I know when we take a look at the AFG budget, which is part of this conversation, and replacement equipment that was ordered last year that has been waiting a year for, has gone up 25–30%. We don't have extra budget to cover the replacement of that type of equipment. And so if we're seeing that kind of inflation already, we have inflationary pressures that we haven't seen, I think, when we've said in 30 or 40 years. I really worry that if we don't find $1 million at this point in time, that is a sustainable $1 million in some capacity, that at this time next year, the pain will be significantly greater. I anticipate we'll be looking for another $1 million or $2 million next year at this time. And so I do appreciate the dilemma that the board has before it right now, but I would like to echo the Secretary Treasurer's comments that I really think $1 million is the minimum of what we're looking for, and it needs to be a sustainable $1 million. We don't want to push the bubble around underneath the blanket and think we're saving over here and find out that it actually pops up over there, and we haven't really saved anything. And we put ourselves in a very precarious financial situation later next year.
Thank you.
I have a question about the Employment Standards Act change, so that's $400,000. Is there any recourse where the government imposes a charge, an additional, so $400,000, it will be our estimated cost, is that? So we don't know what it will be. We're anticipating it'll be $400,000, is that right? Yes.
Yeah. It is estimated based on the presumption that those employees who are entitled to that 5 days will access most of those 5 days. So I think we're assuming it on average 4 days. And initially, when we first learned of it over spring break, we were actually thinking, well, maybe it'll be more like 2 days. But really discussing with other districts, with HR, and understanding those employee groups, when you have 0 days, and you know how 5 is not a lot. You can imagine they will be used. And when we were looking at the estimate, we were consulting with other districts. We consulted with Cowichan and with Comox, and they, and with a few other districts, I can't recall which, but they all had similar estimates that we did. I think so, yeah.
So there's no recourse to say, you know, I don't know, the channels or advocacy or something where this is being imposed but not funded. Means the government, I know it was sort of sprung on the district without any notice to say, well, how are we going to pay for this?
It was actually sprung on the Ministry of Education too. I know staff, they were wondering where it was coming. There is an example from a few years ago when the government eliminated MSP and they replaced it with the employer health tax. And the employer health tax ended up being a lot more expensive than MSP. And particularly in 1 year where they actually implemented the employer health tax before eliminating the MSP, like they had a period of double taxation. It's interesting, and government initially did not fund that additional cost. And eventually it did after a tremendous amount of pressure from the K-12 and other sectors. And so my hope is that maybe something like that could, well, I think it should also happen for this change to the Employment Standards Act. But at the same time, I think government's also under a lot more pressure financially, so I just don't know.
Okay, thanks, because that would cover off, the motion is to find another, basically 202,500. It's not, the motion is to come up with almost 800,000 and find another 200,000.
I'm leaning towards not supporting the motion, but supporting Trustee McMurphy's original comments of really working on the advocacy, because we are not alone. Reading the clippings every day, school districts are plugging their noses and voting for these huge cuts because of inflationary pressures. It's unfair. The Employment Standards Act amendment is unfair to school districts as well. Trustee Van Well, you must have some inside info in Chair Dunford about what BCSTA is doing about going to the government to say, how are we going to manage this? It's not going to end this inflationary trajectory anytime soon anyway. So that would be another discussion, but as far as the motion goes, that's where I stand.
So if there's no other discussion on this motion, so we'll vote on it at this time. So all those in favor of Trustee McMurphy's motion? Those opposed? So the motion is. Okay, so yeah, of course.
Because we're in committee as a whole, the decision-making process can be a little bit more hopefully be similar to a committee meeting where there's 3 voting members in a standing committee, and if 2 of them go forward. In this scenario, if it's 3 out of 5, the majority of the trustees are in agreement that something moves forward, it's moving forward, but then it's actually voted on by the board once we move out of the committee of the whole.
Okay. All right. So moving forward, we obviously recommendation to the board. So do somebody have something to propose? What's a motion? Oh, right. Yeah, no, I think we will, as committee of the whole, we need a recommendation for the 2022-23 budget.
I could move you right.
Well, I would move, make a recommendation that the committee of the whole put to the board the staff recommendation for balancing the budget, the preliminary budget of 2022-23, which is what the proposal presented is. Proposal is
The alternative for balancing the budget.
Yeah.
The whole thing.
Just to clarify, it's actually over the recommendation, because there's some options in there, so it's wasn't a recommendation of what to implement, but the options for finding that.
Well, yeah, okay, so then we go to the discussion that we started with as to whether or not to impose transportation fees versus reducing the teacher FTEs that were to be reduced by 0.75. So for example, we could say reduce ISTBS teacher allocation by 3.25 FTEs. And then that would be imposing transportation fees. The question is, which this came up, I think, at back, was what's the cost of imposing transportation fees? Like how much administrative work is going to go into that?
So in coming up with the estimate of 70,000, it reflected that we wouldn't collect fees from everyone because we have policies around affordability, which is a consideration. And it also reflected additional cost for additional clerical to come in on a call-in basis. So that I believe it was $40 to $50, and probably would be $50. And it reflected that not everybody would pay, and that we would need to allocate some money to bring in part-time clerical, because we actually had to do that prior to these being eliminated 5 years ago. Because we're receiving payments from thousands of people, over 3,000 people.
So do you think it's cost effective then? I mean, it still ends up being.
Yeah, well, we estimate it would bring in $70,000.
And it would cost,
That is net of
that's net, okay.
the cost, yeah.
Chair, is there a motion on the floor?
There isn't at this point. I don't think Trustee Silzer has a specific one. Would you like to put one on?
We need to think about it.
I'll have a go.
Okay. Chair Dunford.
That the committee recommends to the board the particulars for balancing the 2022-2023 preliminary budget by applying the by applying the entries, for lack of a better word, listed in the staff recommendation on page 6 of the briefing note, with the exception of the reduced teacher leader FTE, 0.1 FTE, and with the exception of implementing the transportation fees of $7,000.
Sorry, what did you take out?
I took out the teacher leader 0.1 FTE of 10.6
Okay, and the transportation.
and the transportation
So
stuff.
$80,000.
Currently, yeah. Seconder for that.
Second that.
Okay. Trustee Stelzer seconded. All right, so we can go into some discussion about that. Anybody have thoughts?
Process, because we're in committee of the whole. I don't think we need to record who moved it and seconded it. I think the committee just did.
Okay. Sure.
There's agreement with it.
Yes, I understand. It's just easier for me to do it that way, because I know that process, the more formal process. Are there any thoughts, any discussions on this?
I have a thought.
Okay.
I support removing the transportation fee. I think it seems like we've talked about it, and it's something that we perhaps don't want to do. The 0.1 FTE was just to kind of equalize the positions. That was my understanding of it, but I'm not going to support the motion. So.
Any other thoughts?
Well,
Did you, sorry, did you want to?
well, we're in committee, so
Yeah. Please go ahead, Chair.
if I have anything to say that's worthwhile, it'd be even less considered probably in committee than any other. So that's, it is unfortunate that the 425 has to be part of this, or at least at this point, has to be part of this. And so the effort of my motion was simply to remove, as Trustee Stout said, the transportation entry, which I think is inappropriate for a number of reasons. I think staff is completely responsible in looking at that. But in this climate of inflation, of the urge to move people to public transit, to buses as opposed to driving, and in putting our hand out to pressed parents and guardians financially, I think this should be the last of our options, even though we're permitted to look at that. And then I think Trustee Stout put her finger on it. Well, I was just simply looking for another $10,000. And if we can preserve that 0.1 FTE position, teacher leader position for the 10, that gives, for me, the math.
Your math backwards.
That's why it was never any good.
I think your motion means that you're reducing it by 59.4, not 80, not 79.
So I want to reduce it by 80, whatever.
Isn't that up to
So you
80,600?
keep leaving it,
Well,
so it puts it back in.
no, I want to take it out.
No, it's already in.
No, it's there. I'm looking at it.
Anyway, you singled it out that you didn't want to do transportation and you didn't want to reduce the teacher leader.
Exactly.
And that equals 59.4, not 80, 79.6,
Okay.
I think.
He likes my math.
Yeah. But he took
So
that
we
reduction out.
would be, no, it would be, we would be reducing it.
It's right now.
His motion was to take that one out
That means,
and the transportation out.
Yes.
Right now, the list adds up to $1,080,000.
Right.
And so we'd be taking 70,000 out, and we'd be taking 10,600 out. So I think we're at 999,500.
that was my intent anyway.
Yes.
I may not have expressed it.
It was thinking 86. 80,000.
But okay, maybe I'm really confused here, help me out. I understood the motion was that you were not reducing the teacher leader FTE, you took that one out.
Yeah.
So there's no reduction there.
Yeah, took the 10,600.
Right. So that reduces the total budget alternatives by 10,600 and 70,000, right? But
It's,
sorry,
it
that
sounds,
increases.
it sounds like
That is actually an increase to the budget by taking that one out. He's adding 10,600 into the budget, not taking it out. I mean, I know what he wants to do, but taking it off the list means it stays in.
This is a proposed reduction, like that 0.1 is.
I know, he's saying it comes off the list of reductions. So it's not a reduction, right?
So it's not a reduction, so we take 10,600.
That increases.
Decreases the number from 1,080,000 to 1,070,000-ish.
If I have $5 in my hand and I take one off,
Now you've got 4.
I'm sorry.
But if you owe $5 and you take one off, then now you only owe 4.
yes.
So that's what he's done.
I'm sorry I started.
Yeah, no, it sounds, I know it sounds like a little.
Anyway, I know what the intention is, I just don't think we got the math right, that's all.
Maybe that's it. That's it. That's advanced math. All right, that's for me. Thank you.
Do
Did
I
you
have
have any other thoughts on?
I best not, I best not.
I was just. Elsie, did you,
Well, I'm pleased to see that we're not reducing teacher leaders in this plan. We're putting back the 0.1.
any other thoughts?
Vote on this?
What's that?
Are we voting on?
Just
recommending that it's voting.
So we have a recommendation to put back the teacher leader FTE or not put it on, and to not put on the transportation fees for the cost of inflation at this point. Does anybody have any other thoughts, questions on this at this point?
Could I just ask a question? If this comes off and reducing the teacher, if we're not doing that, then can someone tell me what that means then for our staffing? How we're going to put the 0.1 back in if we've already settled staffing, or is that something that's easily done? It's easily done. Is that a true question?
Sorry, Chair, I didn't hear the answer. If I could-
She says it's easily done. All right,
And could I ask another question?
of course, yes.
I'm just wondering why, you did actually speak to why you want the 0.1 back in. Do you mind giving us rationale on that, why you think it's important to keep that 0.1?
Well, if my version of the math were correct, it would come close to $70 million. But I chose that one as well. And you're quizzical, I can tell, because we're still struggling, at least I am, with my math. But also, if we're talking about a $10,000 entry, that's a teacher leader. That's a frontline person who may be moving into admin at some point, who's teaching, who is there for our students. It's small, cold comfort compared to losing 4 ISDs, but it's something.
That is not actually then a reduction to the budget.
No.
So with respect, front line are the teachers, they're the classroom teachers. And I think that the teacher leader positions are important, but front line is in the classroom. And in the briefing note, the secretary and treasurer said that it made sense to reduce one assignment from 0.5 to 0.4 so that all leadership assignments are consistent. And I think this is an example of a small saving that was available. And, you know, if that's, you know, you cobble together a few of those and maybe then you save a front, what I would call a frontline teaching position.
So,
Chair Dunford.
so I'm not wedded to that item. That was to try to get us in my version of math, close to where we need to be. But if there are proposed amendments that I can support, that make more sense, I'm happy to think about it.
I'm sorry to belabor this, but, and I know I'm handicapped when it comes to arithmetic.
So am I.
But as I understand it, if you take out that reducing the teacher leader, then that reduces the reductions. And that means it's an increase to the cost, increased cost to the budget.
I don't think so.
Well, that's what it says, reduce it, and you're saying don't reduce it. Yeah, I know. But then the difference is, reduce the teacher leader is a minus, but the transportation fees is a plus. So you can't treat them both as
Apples and oranges.
as negatives, as removals. One is an addition.
They're, just for clarification, yeah, they're not presented, I know one is revenue, but these are presented as budget savings.
Yes.
Right,
And
so one is increasing revenues and one is decreasing expense.
exactly, but Chair Dunkler has taken out, reduced the teacher leader as an increase, that would be an increase to the budget, the proposed budget. So the actual impact of those is to change that total budget alternative line, reduce it by 59.4, not 80,000.
It is 80,000 because if we choose not to make a budget reduction of 10,000 and then we choose not to increase our revenues, both of those reduce the budgetary balance. One's going this way and that way, but the way they're presented is the impact on budget pressure.
I get it.
We need to find $1 million, we don't need to find $1,080,000. So we've got to take the 80,000 off the list to make it $1 million.
I didn't really see
Megan nodding her head.
This was proposed as a reduction, and now you're saying we're not reducing it.
What he said
Yeah.
is what I meant.
So if you're not reducing an expenditure or you're not increasing revenue, then either way, that $1,080,000 number comes down. They both go in the same direction. Because decrease in expense or increasing your revenue both increase this number, which is the budget balance.
Okay. All right. I think we can agree that Secretary Treasurer knows what he's doing.
So this does mean that we're going to increase the teacher leader
No,
contingent by 0.1.
no, we're just not reducing it. We won't be increasing it. We're just not reducing it.
It's like saying, okay, we need $100. Could everybody please give me $10? Because we need $100. But then we've got 12 people, we're gonna have $120 instead of the 100. So then you say, no, you don't give me 10 and you give me 5 and you don't give me.
This is not helping me.
I like it
Can I have hers?
Yeah, all right.
I admit my ignorance and stupidity and inability to deal with math, and I still think I'm right.
Well, if I'm right, it's entirely a fluke.
All right. I think at this point we need to decide with the motion on the floor, if we would like to support that motion or not, or if anybody would like to do an amendment to that motion. Would anybody like to do an amendment at this point?
Okay, I guess I have to get back to my original thing about saying, well, if we can save 0.75 of a special education, an IST or BS, then we should do it there and impose the transportation. But that's the balancing act, making more work to get the 70,000, as opposed to putting our effort into advocacy to say to the government, give us more money. It's like up here, applying for increased funding would be get our advocacy going through the BCSTA and whatever other means we can.
So that would be entirely different, so I think, for right now, I think let's deal with that specific one. I do have one quick question. If we went with Chair Dunford's, that sort of not quite hitting the $1 million, it's just under, is that going to hit the mark?
Yeah, that's fine.
Is it? Okay, all right. Okay, so I'm gonna ask trustees now whether they would like to support Chair Dunford's motion or not. So all those in favor of Chair Dunford's motion? And all those opposed? Okay. So we have consensus.
No,
Yes.
we have a vote.
Well, sorry. Yes, fair enough. Fair enough. We have a vote. We have a majority. We have a majority. Thank you. We have a slim majority. To recommend by motion to balance the budget using these alternatives for balancing the budget with the teacher leader off and the transportation fees off. So now we need to rise and report. Is that correct? Is that
And we can do a motion to the committee to rise and report. So somebody can move a motion and then have a vote on it. The committee would rise and report on the recommendation to balance the budget, and then it goes to the board and it's debated again.
Yes. Okay, so can I get a motion for the committee to rise and report?
Chair, just an inquiry. I indicated I had some other motions I wanted to move. Do you want to deal with those in committee, or do you want to deal with them after we visit?
It's up to the committee. It's up to the committee.
Yeah.
If the committee is okay with rising and reporting.
Okay. You have a motion too.
If there are motions, it might be more expedient to do it as a board instead of committee of the whole. Because the purpose of committee of the whole is really to have that free flow discussion to kind of come to a motion.
Okay. So can I have a motion to rise and report? Trustee Seltzer?
Second.
Chair Dunford? All those in favor? All those opposed? Okay. Well, the motion is carried. All right. I believe at this point, Chair Dunford will come back.
Thank you, trustees, and I'll call upon Committee Chair Van Well to report from the Committee of the Whole, please.
So, the committee of the whole, we had some discussions for recommendations to balance the budget. And at this time, the committee recommends that the
Go ahead, read out the wording recorded.
yeah.
Okay, that the board balanced the 22-23 budget by applying the entries on the 6th page of the budget presentation, but removing the entries relating to reducing teacher leader FTE by 0.1 and the implementation of transportation fees for $70,000.
You're moving that?
I move that.
Is there a seconder for that? Trustee Selzy? Discussion? Trustee Van Well? Give you the opportunity.
All right. I think that given the situation that we're in, no cuts are going to be easy at all. And I believe that these are given that we do need to balance $1 million and not, go into any more of our contingency fund, this is, I don't know the word to use, but I think this is the best that we have right now. Yes.
Thank you. Further discussion on the recommendation? Seeing none, I'll put the question. All in favor of the recommendation as moved by Trustee Van Well? Opposed? The motion is carried. I gather that we may have some other motions, Trustee Stella.
Thank you, Chair. I would just like to, the BCSTA passed I'll put the motion on and maybe I'll describe why I'm doing this. I'd like to move that the BCSTA determine how many districts had to cut programs and teaching positions as a direct result of unfunded inflationary costs. And the second part to that the BCSTA strongly advocate on behalf of all districts for the funding of inflationary costs on an ongoing basis.
Thank you.
Those written down?
Pardon?
Do you have those written down?
I do. Yeah. I can pass this to you. What's the page?
Oh, sorry.
Would you be okay with requesting the BCSDA to determine? I don't think we can insist that they
What did I say? What was the wording? I can't remember what the wording was.
The UCSDA determined how many districts had to cut programs and teaching positions.
So my idea was that there was a motion that was passed at the BCSTA AGM that where the BCSTA urged the Ministry of Finance and Education to fully fund all incremental payroll and other inflationary costs that haven't been covered for the 2022-23 school year. What my motion does is it builds on that, where we're asking the BCSTA with their resources to look at is to determine how many districts had to cut programs and teachers because of the unfunded inflationary costs. So what is the direct link between teachers and programs and the unfunded inflationary costs, which I gather is for us at 100%. So that's the first part of it. So use your resources to get this information. It's out there. We know that Victoria, different districts have had to cut because of this. Put it all together, and then the BCSTA strongly advocate on behalf of all districts for the funding of inflationary costs on an ongoing basis. Because I know that our parents, the people that I've talked to in our community, they have no idea that we are cutting $1 million because the government hasn't funded it. So that is not out there. People don't know about it. And I think we've written letters, you know, to Santa School District, but we need something big. We need the BCSTA to perhaps go to the media with, you know, their researched information and say, this is what it looks like. The way that, you know, people are saying you could get a vet more quickly than a family doctor. So that's the kind of information that we need to push this thing forward, and for next year. Or for now, for right now. And we pay $38,000 a year, if I understand, to the BCSTA. I would like the BCSTA to help us move this forward in a more aggressive and informational way.
Thank you. Other,
Is there a second?
Yeah.
yeah, trustee Martin seconded it. Yeah. Other discussion on the motion? Trustee Silver?
I support the motion, and think that our board has a responsibility to advocate and to let the local news outlets know this as well. Because it seems to me that there are newspapers all over the province who are reporting this, and their communities do know that it's inflationary pressures that are causing boards to go through this agonizing process. I guess I can work on a motion to say what we should be doing as well. Because I'm sure that the chair and our BCSTA representative can tell us in more detail exactly what the BCSTA and other district or the powers that be amongst the chairs and the organization have been doing. And perhaps, Chair, you've met with Gordon Lee already? And did you discuss this?
So I think we should deal with this motion first, trustee Silver, and then if you wish to make a motion about that kind of local advocacy,
Yes.
certainly we can entertain that. And I can offer whatever information relates to that at that point. But straight from this motion.
Okay, so specifically then, we're writing a letter to the BCSTA. Is that what the motion means? Just for clarification.
I'm assuming that if it's adopted by the board, a letter will go to BCST and saying, our board has moved this motion.
Requesting that information, and requesting further action on the part of the organization. Okay. Thank you.
There may be some other things. You'll recall the June 8th meeting we have next Wednesday, where BCSTA powers that be over there. One of the questions apparently on the agenda is how they can assist us. So this plays right into that discussion if we adopt this. Is there any other discussion or debate on the motion by trustee Sneller? I'll put the question. All in favor? Opposed? Motion's carried. Now, trustee Silzer, did you have a motion at this point? And then trustee Murphy followed. Okay, then we'll go to trustee McMurphy.
First of all, a question through you to the secretary treasurer or whoever wants to answer it. The additional costs of sick leave that were imposed upon school districts, did that come through the Ministry of Labor? Or what ministry?
I'm not sure if it was a legislative change. It comes through the Ministry of Labor. But as we discussed previously, we hadn't been following it that closely because we had been advised that it wouldn't it wouldn't impact school districts because where a collective agreement was in place that was superior. Overall, it would require 5 days for everybody. But then the change seemed to happen very late in the process. And I'm aware how we just split about it over spring break.
Okay, it was the Ministry of Labor that let us know, or was it the Ministry of Education?
It was BCPC, our Employers Association.
Let us know.
My understanding, Trustee McMurphy, was that it was the Ministry of Labor,
Yeah.
and I believe it was the Minister of Labor who announced it.
Yeah. Okay, so, okay, I'll try this. The School District 63 seek reimbursement from the Ministry of Labor for the additional costs, approximately $400,000, of the recent changes to the Employment Standards Act requiring school boards to provide 5 days of annual sick leave for certain employees not covered by other sick leave provisions.
Second, Trustee Stout. Trustee McMurphy.
Well, I was going to move a motion suggesting that we forego our increase in our stipend, but I don't know if we do that now, so I've got this one instead. No, seriously, I mean, to just dump a 400,000, I mean, for us, 400,000, God knows what it was for other school districts. To just dump that on us and say, find it, is unconscionable. I mean, it's even worse, I think, than the inflationary costs that the Ministry of Education is not funding. Because, you know, this is just sort of right out of the blue, and it's right off the top, and it's sort of, we didn't even get to talk about it or, you know, discuss it or anything. We just landed on our budgets with a great, huge thud. And I think this is maybe something, you know, following on Trustee Stella's motion about what we could talk to the BCSDA about, that might be part of it. But I think we should send them a bill.
Other discussion? Let's see if we will. All in favor? Opposed? Motion's carried. Further motions, Trustee McMurphy?
That's it.
And Trustee Silzer, I see you've been busy scribbling. Are you ready to present a motion?
Okay, this might be close, okay. That the board prepare an op-ed article for the Peninsula News Review under the chair's name to explain to the community the budgetary dilemma caused by the Ministry of Education and Child Care's refusal to fund inflationary pressures for the 2022-23 budget, school district budget.
Do you want to limit it to the news review, or are you thinking of
Well, I guess
something broader?
Times Home, the local media.
Is there a seconder? Trustee Van Wel? Trustee Silzer, would you like to speak to your motion?
Yes, well, it follows along the lines of Trustee Stout's motion, but it brings to our community the issue more clearly, and also treats perhaps. Well, it's a way of also recognizing and respecting all those 1,000 people who replied, who took our survey, and took the time to be involved in our budget consultation and kind of explain why we've had to make the decision we're making and what we're hoping will happen, and put the emphasis on pressuring the government within our community and through other organizations.
Further discussion? Trustee Stelper.
I just have a couple of thoughts, and I'm not opposed to the idea. It's just that people that read newspapers, and I'm just going to go on a bit of a limb here, are generally, I'm going to say over 50, maybe over 60. So you're not getting a segment of the population that read printed papers. So that's not to say we shouldn't do it. I'm also wondering too whether it makes sense for us to liaise with Victoria and Souk and have a tri-district something in the paper between the three districts, so there's something cohesive, and it just has a bit more punch to it than just our district. And I really wouldn't want it to come across like complaining. It's what it is it's information, pressure on the government by informing voters what the effect of the government's decisions are.
I'm really torn here because I really like the idea of getting out in print and saying, giving our mea culpas. But it also exposes us because it's pretty hard to justify or to explain in an article like that why we chose to reduce 4 teachers rather than doing something else. You know, that's the difficulty we get into. And we can talk about it in here and, with an audience that has some understanding of what we're talking about and, but to put it out in a newspaper release saying, we had no choice. That's where it makes us vulnerable, I think. So I'm just not sure how to vote on this. Because the idea of explaining why we had to cut the budget is one thing, but explaining what we did to cut the budget, we have to include that, and that's where it gets a bit difficult for me, because I'm not sure the public will understand that our only recourse was to do that major thing, which was to cut 5 teachers. So, I don't know.
Trustee Stelper.
This is all what we draft, and obviously we're not going to draft a letter here now, but the gist of it is advocacy to get the government to fund inflationary pressures and to say that we're not alone. We've got the other districts throughout the province, the ones whose enrollment is not going up, especially. So there's a lot of detail. You're right. It can get messy, but there's probably a way, if we have a communications manager, they probably figure this out really nicely to, they'd have the time to do the kind of advocacy op-ed piece that would explain our local situation without making us vulnerable to attack, let's say. So, there are risks, but this is also part of advocacy. And when you do advocacy, that's what you risk, is some of the people will agree and some of them won't. But the fact is, this is a fairness situation, as we've noted, on 2 fronts, the Employment Standards Act and just the incredible rise in inflation that hasn't been taken into consideration with this year's funding. So
I have myself on the speakers list too, Trustee Silzer, thank you. And I think on balance, I would support the motion. For some years, I've wondered why the local media has very little interest in what we do. And it's not completely for a lack of effort by the district. There have been media releases that have not been picked up. For some reason, other districts get other circulations. And periodicals seem to be seem to be impressed more than we are, and it's been this way a long time. So on balance, I think whatever we can do, as you said, to bring this forward. I'm alive to Trustee McMurphy's concern. But I think with the skill of our senior staff, we're able to present in such an article the arguments that convince some of the trustees, the majority of trustees, that there really was no choice because of future concerns, possibility of increased cuts next year, problems with the accumulated surplus and contingency, and those kinds of things. So I'm confident that it can be crafted in such a way as to mitigate that concern, and whether it's a risk or not. I think for me, I'm prepared to do that. I did want to comment too on Trustee Stelz's suggestion that we involve Sue and Victoria in the enterprise. I don't take it that we're doing so in this motion, at least yet. And I have worked together with the other chairs in the past. There were 1 or 2 articles. They took a bit of a time to prepare, and I think we want to move quickly on this. So it may be, Trustee Stelz, we want to consider that separately, but I think it probably doesn't fit as neatly as it could here. Yes, Trustee Stelz.
I agree. I'm just agreeing with your point because Suk is is increasing enrollment. They don't have this problem. And Victoria has been in the news for, it just seems like they're in a different world sometimes compared to our situation. Thank God.
Secretary Turner.
Just, did I confirm who the seconder was on?
Trustee Van Moen.
And we will need, if you have it, a written copy of the last 2 motions, the reimbursement from the Minister of Labor, and also the motion for the op-ed.
Could you read us yours again, Trustee Stelz, before we vote?
Because I take Trustee Stelz's point about media to make me say rather than DNR, say local media, which includes the electronic newsletters that I'm sure is on. So that the board prepare an op-ed article for the local, for distribution to local media. Explaining why this school district 63 has had to come up with $1 million to cover inflationary pressures, not funded by the Ministry of Education and Childcare.
Any further discussion on that, folks? All right, I'll put the question, all in favor? Opposed? Motion's carried. Anything further, colleagues? Trustee McMurphy.
This is around tonight's topic at all. We're finished with tonight's topic.
Yes.
I just don't know if people remember Superintendent of Spanish Schools by the name of Don Smith. Quite some time ago, am I the only one that's out of it? Anyway, just died. The superintendent here? Yeah.
When was his tenure?
Probably in the 70s, 80s, early 80s, late 70s.
Before Jack Town?
His son is a superintendent and still is, just retired, in retirement this year, retired already in Alberta. And his other son has a farm out on West Notch Road, Market Garden,
And Kevin Forrest, so is, his other son.
Don just died.
All right, trustees, that appears to be the business for the evening. Is there any objection to adjourning at this point? Hearing none, I declare the meeting adjourned at 9:50. Thank you again for your contributions to some very difficult deliberations.
I answered. Did you see me look up? That's great.
Bye, everybody.